Today I'll be talking on the subject of home monitoring in the Ketotic GSDs. So our objectives for today, we're going to do a brief review of literature. We'll talk about options for home monitoring. That includes meters, urine dipsticks, and continuous glucose monitors. We'll spend a brief time reviewing ketones. What are they and what are their function? We'll review best practices regarding home monitoring. We'll talk about frequency of home monitoring, what the recommendations are for that. We'll talk about goals for home monitoring, and then we'll just end with a summary slide. So when looking at the literature regarding the topic of home monitoring, I went back to the guidelines, and what you're seeing there is an example of the ACMG practice guidelines for type 6 and 9. These were published in 2019, and they include general recommendations for blood glucose and ketone monitoring in the Ketotic GSDs, and this paper specifically type 6 and 9. And then these are the practice guidelines for the type 3. These are, as Dr. Ryan pointed out, are a little bit older. These were published in 2010, and these also include general guidelines or recommendations for blood glucose monitoring, but they don't offer specific guidance regarding ketone monitoring for the type 3s. And then this is an example. There's lots of papers now starting to talk about the use of continuous glucose monitoring in the management of glycogen storage disorders, and this is one of many examples that are currently published on this topic. So let's get into the nuts and bolts of today's conversation. So home monitoring. As far as monitoring options, there's 3 primary options for home monitoring, and the first option that we're going to talk about are blood glucose and ketone meters. So these meters work by analyzing a small amount of capillary blood, which reacts with an enzyme and then is able to estimate the concentration of glucose or ketones in the blood sample. Regarding brands, most clinics recommend the Freestyle products for blood glucose monitoring, which I also support. We're also part of the current GSD 1A trials through Ultragenics, and they're using the Roche AccuCheck in that study, and I'm seeing really good accuracy with that product as well. So oftentimes this is insurance driven, so sometimes it comes down to what the insurance will pay. So I think having a meter is the most important thing. And then as far as the keto meters, the Precision Ultra is the current available product for that. So what are best practices regarding using these products? These are basics, but I think it's good to review. This is real basic, but we want you to wash your hands with soap and water, dry your hands before you use your Lancet. Want to make sure that your test supplies are not damaged or expired. You want to use a new Lancet each time you test. And again, this seems like a really basic concept, but I did have a patient that was reusing Lancets, so that's a no-no. Please use a new Lancet each time you test. And then this is also really important. I noticed this on the video that was shown from Moderna. It's really important that for the little ones, once they start walking, it's important to transition ideally from the heel and start using the finger. That's really the recommended spot once you're walking. And then as far as site for the finger, we recommend using the side of the finger near the tip. So we talked about how you can monitor ketones in blood using a ketone meter. You can also monitor ketones using urine keto sticks. And this is often a cost-saving measure for families that don't have insurance coverage for the expensive ketone meters and test supplies. They're very expensive. And so this is a good option if they're not covered or if it's cost prohibitive. The one thing to know when you're using the keto sticks is they're not as sensitive as testing your ketones in blood. And so the keto stick often will not pick up levels unless they're above 1 millimole or higher. So to get those lower elevations, you really need the more sensitive ketone meter for that. So just know what the limitations are of the products that you're using. So we talked about two different ways of measuring ketones. We can measure them using a ketone meter. We can also measure them using a keto stick. So let's take a brief pause and review what ketones are. I think this is an important concept to understand. So what are ketones? They're acids that our body makes when your body is burning fats instead of glucose for energy. So next question we want to ask ourselves are, what are their function? And I think before we answer that, it's important to understand that and I think this has been discussed in other lectures, but it's a really important concept to understand that the brain isn't able to store energy for use, and it relies on a continuous source of glucose as a primary energy substrate. But what is important is that it can use ketones as an alternative energy source. So what are the function of ketones? They provide that alternative energy source for both the brain, the heart, and the muscles when glucose reserves are low. So that's important to know. So regarding ketones, what is normal versus pathological levels of ketones in your body? So we talked about how ketones are a backup source of energy when your glucose reserves are running low. So in some regards, it's normal and safe to have some ketones in your blood because it's normal and safe for your body to sometimes have to utilize its backup energy source, or fats, when there's not enough usable glucose. But on the other hand, too many ketones in your blood can make your blood acidic and indicates an energy imbalance. So it's a delicate balance. We're going to review what too much is as far as target levels in another slide. So the last option I want to talk about for home monitoring, we talked about meters, we talked about dipsticks, and the third option for home monitoring is a continuous glucose meter. Continuous glucose meter, they're great. It's a newer technology, and they're able to continually monitor and give real-time updates on blood glucose measurements through a device that is attached to your body, and then it sends a signal to a receiver, which is often the patient or the parent's phone, or sometimes it's a separate device. In our clinic, we're using primarily the Freestyle Libre 3 or the Dexcom. The newest version is the G7. You can see they're both very small. They've become these newer generations have become easier and easier to use. The technology's easy. They're now coming in a just one applicator instead of a two-piece application. The Dexcom now comes in a single applicator. The Libre's been this style for a little while. They're super simple. It's just push down and click, and then it applies this little sensor to the patients. For older patients, it's the back of the arm. Younger children can also use the upper buttocks. But these devices have really revolutionized our ability to really have important information to optimize glycemic control in the GSD. So I'm a big advocate of continuous glucose monitors. What's important to understand, though, when we're talking about continuous glucose monitors is what compartment is being measured when we're thinking about the CGM. So the CGM sensor, it sits in the interstitial space, and on the other side, your meters are measuring blood from the capillary bed. So there is a difference as far as compartments where you're measuring your blood glucose from. And it does take time for diffusion for the blood to go from the blood vessel or capillary space up into the interstitial space. So there can be, and there is generally a lag between the true fingerstick blood glucose value and what you're seeing from the CGM. So you need to understand that, and it's particularly relevant during periods of rapid change. So right after eating a meal, maybe if your blood glucose, if you've extended your fasting and now your blood glucose is dropping and you check your BGM, you may see a different value than what you're seeing on your CGM because, again, it takes time during periods of rapid change for the CGM to catch up with the true fingerstick blood glucose value. But it doesn't mean that what you're seeing on your BGM still isn't valuable information. It's really good trending information. And so it's important that you understand those concepts when you're using these devices. Sorry, I forgot to push my buttons here. As far as calibration can improve accuracy, and I do recommend that if the device you're using has that function. Currently, the Freestyle Libre 3 does not allow calibration. It just has internal algorithms that you need to trust. But the G7 does have a calibration feature, and I do recommend calibrating if you need it. But if on the other hand, your device is working well, then I don't recommend calibrating. So we base that decision on what we call the 20/20 rule, and I'll go over that now in this slide. So what is the 20/20 rule? It's a goal of accepted accuracy of the CGM, and it's defined as 20% of the meter value when the meter value is 80 milligrams or, per deciliter or higher, or on the other hand, if you have a lower, 20 milligrams of the meter value when the meter value is under 80 milligrams per deciliter. So an example for that, so if your blood glucose meter is reading 90, then you're above 80, so now it's a 20%. So 20% of 90 would give you a range of 72 to 108, which would be considered an acceptable range of what we call corroboration between the BGM and the CGM value. So those are considered close enough that you wouldn't want to calibrate if you're within those ranges. And we only recommend calibrating when the CGM is in a stable place or the arrow is pointing sideways. And then conversely, if you have a lower number, let's say your BGM is reading 70, again, now you're below 80, so it's 20%, just an actual 20 above and below. So you can do the calculations. It would be a close match if your CGM is reading anywhere from 50 to 90. That would be considered a close match. So best practices as far as calibration. These are things to remember to make sure that calibration actually is working for you and not working against you. You don't want to over-calibrate. It can really mess up the G7 in particular. I only recommend calibrating after the first 24 hours. So give some time for those internal algorithms to really optimize before you consider calibrating. So wait at least 24 hours. You also don't want to calibrate if the sensor is off from the BGM value due to what we call a pressure low. So again, the sensor sitting in the interstitial space, if there's pressure on that, there's not good diffusion to the sensor, and so your numbers often are going to be off at that point. Just relieve the pressure and allow it to auto-correct again. So wait rather than abruptly calibrating if there's just a sensor low. I touched base on this earlier, we really recommend calibrating when the arrow is pointing sideways. That's a period of stability, so you don't want to calibrate again when there's periods of rapid change. So we do want you to be checking your blood sugar, your blood glucose with your meter at those time points. Especially, we really recommend using your BGM when you're wearing your CGM. If you get a reading that doesn't seem to be fitting the circumstances or you're surprised by what you're seeing, you need to validate that reading before you make a treatment decision. So your child's meter goes off, you're like, wow, we just fed him a half an hour ago, why is the meter going off? Before you make a treatment decision based on that value, make sure you use your BGM and corroborate what the CGM is telling you. And then if the arrow is pointing up or down and you want to corroborate that again, please do, but wait to calibrate if you think it's running off till that arrow is pointing sideways, because again, it'll help with those internal algorithms. It won't disrupt, it'll actually help to get things in better alignment. So let's switch gears now and talk about how often should you be checking. And this, again, is individualized, but there are some recommendations. These are general recommendations coming from the current published guidelines, and I think we're mostly familiar with these, but it's recommended to use your blood glucose and ketone meter, if you have that, before meals or cornstarch doses, before bedtime, first thing in the morning, and then during illness or when changes are made to diet or schedule. So we're looking at, a new school season in the fall. The child's schedule is always just a little bit different, when lunch might be, when they start, when they go home, or maybe they're starting some new activities in the fall, whatever. Those are times to consider really re-engaging with technology and making sure that you're checking frequently and making sure that your child or you as an adult, if your schedule is changing, that you're re-engaging with technology and making sure that you're where you think you are as far as your current nutrition plan. What about the continuous glucose monitors? How often should we be using these? So there's currently no consensus regarding the frequency of use of CGMs in the Ketotic GSDs. Depending on the make or model, they have different wear times. The G7, the current wear time is 10 days. The Freestyle, the current wear time is 14 days, so they're intended to last that long. But how often should you actually be using them? We do, again, there's nothing currently as far as a consensus statement in any of the current guidelines, because they're all a little bit older, and I don't think there's that information in them yet. But in our clinic, we do recommend frequent use for younger children. It makes sense that have more frequent tendency towards hypoglycemia. And in older, more stable patients, at minimum, we recommend intermediate use, especially when they're coming to clinic. We're wanting to see what their trends are. We're wanting to optimize their dietary management. We ask at minimum for them to engage in when they're prior to their clinic visits. And then, of course, I really encourage more frequent use for patients. I really think it provides valuable insight that really helps them to optimize their glycemic control. So a lot of this is driven too on insurance coverage. These devices are very expensive, so some people have to limit use based on their ability, on the cost of the product. So again, that can drive clinical decision making as well. So let's talk about some goals for home monitoring. So there's not a clear consensus in the literature. It's important that we know that regarding goals for blood glucose monitoring in the Ketotic GSDs. But I'm going to, the current published guidelines recommend ranges anywhere from 70 to 140 in the Ketotic GSDs. But some authors recommend tighter control. Our goal when we're monitoring with these devices is always to prevent hypoglycemia and minimize ketosis, but what is the actual number that best meets that goal? And that's not really clear in the current literature. But again, there's a range of 70 to 140 in the current guidelines, and some newer literature is recommending tighter management between 70 to 100 to prevent hyperglycemia, to prevent counter-regulatory mechanisms, and to prevent insulin response. So in our clinic, we do recommend this tighter window of 70 to 100 pre-prandial or before the meal to try and prevent those problems and to have that tighter control. So 75 to 100 milligrams per deciliter pre-prandial or before the meal. What about ketone goals? Again, ketones serve as an alternative energy source at a time when glucose reserves are running low, and our goals are always to minimize ketosis and to prevent hypoglycemia. So what are our targets when we're thinking about that? The recommendation currently, again, there's nothing, there's not a current consensus in the literature, but Gene Reviews recommends keeping ketones within that normal range, which is right below 0.3 millimoles per liter. In our clinic, we do allow some physiologic variations up to 0.5, but we obviously aim for normal, which is 0.3 or less. So again, the ideal is 0.3 or less. We accept in our clinic up to 0.5 for some physiologic variations, but I think the goal is always to try and normalize as much as possible. And then what about goals for wearing your continuous glucose monitor? So again, the primary goals are the same with this device, which is, again, is to maintain normal blood glucose and to minimize ketosis, always in the Ketotic GSDs. This is just another tool to help you achieve that. So again, the CGM is a powerful tool. It provides real-time data that really helps you to make good decisions throughout your day, especially in regard to nutrition management. It'll give you insight into what various foods are doing to your blood glucose and your trends, and you can make better decisions moving forward if you see that, you know, a certain food causes your blood sugar to spike or you react. You can lower the volume, you can avoid that food. It really helps kind of in the moment see what food does to your glucose trends. So I think CGMs are really a good device for helping provide that information. So let's end here with just some summary takeaways. So in summary, diligent home monitoring with keto sticks, meters, so both ketone meters, blood glucose meters, keto sticks, CGMs, they help patients with Ketotic GSDs achieve their primary objective, which is normal glycemia and ketone suppression. We reviewed target ranges to achieve these goals, but currently there's no clear consensus on the practical aspects of home monitoring, and there's a lack of evidence for best practices. So we have our work to do. We need to work on new updated guidelines. And thanks everybody for your attention. Does anybody have any questions? All right, so Dr. Dirks is going to follow up with a similar kind of continuing the conversations regarding CGM. So thanks everybody.